Good afternoon, all. Thank you for attending our earnings results webinar. My name is Layla Asaraf from the Saudi Exchange Listing Division. We're extremely thrilled to have you all with us today attending this webinar, which just highlights how important IR officers' role have become in the capital markets. And as you know, the exchange has been adamant in further developing and improving the IR function among its listed companies. So we're hoping through this series of workshops with our issuers in collaboration with MIRA to cover and highlight the many facets of IR, of which today's topic is essential to cover. So as you may know, earnings season is considered important for investors and analysts, where they typically plan their trades and update their estimates and such. Announcing your earnings results may affect stock performance overall. So planning for your earnings publications and calls ahead of time for results season really helps with transparency and market perceptions. Therefore, we aim to cover all of that and much more details about earnings in this webinar with our esteemed speakers, George Allen, a partner from Instinctif, and with an extensive IR field experience. And from our recent winner of Most Notable Listing Award, Dr. Sulaiman and Habib Medical Group, we have Haitham, AlShathri, Director of Investor Relations. And now I would like to hand it off to our colleague from MIRA, John Gollifer. John, the floor is yours.
Layla, thank you very much, and a warm welcome to everybody for joining us. It's always pleasing to work with the Saudi Exchange. It's great when we get the sort of response that we've got in terms of registrations. Of course, as always, these events are recorded, so if you happen to miss some of it, and I know certainly from my point of view, Layla faded in and out a bit, so that might be her connection. I'm hoping that you can hear me clearly. I'm hoping that you hear the other speakers clearly. But if there's any issue, we have help on hand through Alicia, of course. So shout if we're not coming through loud and clear. On behalf of the Middle East Investor Relations Association, or MIRA, your professional body for IR, thanks so much for taking the time to join us for what on the surface, as described by Layla, looks quite straightforward for IR teams. But I like the way that Layla described it as a workshop, and you'll notice that George and I have dispensed with the jackets, pens in hand, and we hope that you're doing the same, because I think institutionalizing best practice is all about starting at the beginning, working our way through thought processes, all the processes that support management and the boards in those investor stories. And I think it goes without saying that to have HMG present, given that they went public only little more than a year or so ago, it's already been said by Layla, they've been recognized in awards. So it's a wonderful case study through the good offices of Haitham and team to share with you. Haitham, by way of background, is a former IRO, or certainly in other IR-related roles before he got to HMG. I believe, Haitham, you were at SIPChem, who we know well as another MIRA member. I'm always pleased to see IROs taking their qualifications seriously, and of course, Haitham boasts the CIRO, or the Certified IR Officer qualification. So thank you very much, Haitham, for joining us. I turn to George. George actually needs no introduction to MIRA. He's one of our most productive partners. He does lots of things with us, not just through the chapters like today, or indeed through the exchange like today, but in many other ways through thought leadership. If you look at his bio, of course, it speaks for itself across sectors, across markets. And interestingly, just talking about the situation of HMG, George would have been there at the beginning when they were going public, I believe about 15, 16 months ago, but we can hear more about that shortly. I just shared with Haitham and George that I'm a big fan of quarterly reporting. I think we only need to think of the last 15 months or so to recognize that the investment community, our audiences, whether on the buy side, the investors, or the sell side, or the helpful intermediaries, including the research analysts, I'm sure would have welcomed regular reporting. And I think we all get that quarterly reporting is a good thing. Some argue that it depends on the nature of the business and the planning horizon, and of course, what exactly you want to say and when you want to say it. But I think it also goes without saying we should remind ourselves that in a disclosure regime, a continuous disclosure regime. It's academic anyway, because if you've got something important to announce over and above your quarterly reporting, you should be doing it anyway. And now let's put into context, if I invite George first. As I said to him before, you know, I mean, sometimes we think this is the bread and butter of the IR calendar. We all get why we report. We try to work hard on refining processes and all the rest of it. And in many ways, we're saving time for management. But I think it's more important than that, George, in terms of strategic IR, in terms of the thinking of the business, the planning of the business, and the direction of the business. And if we just look at HMG, relatively new public company, clearly coming to market, had purpose. Clearly they had plans. And I'm sure while Haitham can share a little more color around the processes, around the objectives and what they do to ensure they meet the statutory reporting requirements, of course, George, it's far more than that, isn't it?
Yeah, thank you, John, and thank you, Layla, for inviting me to speak today. And it's a pleasure to be speaking to everyone on this call. Yeah, John, I agree. There's a much longer term view, really, beyond earnings. Now, while in the Saudi market, earnings obviously cover quarter to quarter, and in other markets, in some other markets, they are on a semi-annual basis, irrespective of how frequently they are disclosed from a regulatory perspective. They do, in our opinion, need to show a longer term strategic narrative. So actually, if you're reporting Q1 or Q2 or Q3, you should really be setting the scene well beyond just the quarter that you're reporting and indeed the quarter that is coming up. But really, at least, if not for the next 12 months, for a longer horizon. And you know, you mentioned Habib Medical Group's listing in 2020. That was a prime example, which Haitham can explain in a little bit more detail, I'm sure, of a company that really set out a very long-term roadmap for the investment community and has continued to do so in its interaction with both the buy side and the sell side stakeholders, is to enable management to engage on a regular basis with their investment community, with all participants in the capital markets, in a formal setting, through, for example, your earnings call and your earnings release, but also to offer a much longer term view, or a lens, if you like, on the key strategic programs that are going to drive shareholder value into the future. And it's really important that the audiences that you're engaging around earnings can be kind of enfranchised into that narrative and understand that narrative. And that management, in delivering that narrative, are able to provide not just key messages, but also key performance indicators as to how they are delivering on those long-term strategic promises. So if you think of the earnings process as the kind of skeleton on which one hangs the body of an IR program, the muscle that goes into not just the earnings process, but the listening and the communicating that goes on in between stops in that cycle, is what gives the program its power. And I think it's really important to contextualize earnings in that way and use them to your advantage, not just as an obligation that you have to the market and to the regulator.
Thank you, George. And I'm now going to turn to Haitham, who, interestingly, Haitham, if I think of the last 15, 16 months, I don't know exactly what date you joined HMG in your current role, but I think just by background, given what we've all been through, it must have been an incredibly testing, if not fascinating, time to join the team. And I'm interested to know what that was like, what you found, how you're organized, before we get into some of the thought process behind results reporting. Welcome, Haitham, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, John. Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon. Thank you so much, Tadawul and Mira, for arranging this series of webinars. I'm pleased to be with you, John, Layla, and George. Well, John, let me start with saying that nowadays a public listed company is not required to get engaged with the investment community or have an investor relation department at all, considering there is no legal requirement to engage in any communication with the investment community outside of the regulator required disclosure. However, when there is no investor relation function, investors must rely on media, internet, or disclosed reports, which is all based on historical information or sometimes on conjecture. With this limited pool of information, investors are less inclined to acquire a company stock or even being engaged with those companies, and will certainly affect on the valuation and trading liquidity. So the key reason of building an effective investor relation function is to maximize the company's presence and shareholders, and maximize the shareholders' value. Nowadays, the IRO does this by continually communicating a company's unique investment proposition to the investment community. Definitely, IROs have a broad array of tools at their disposal, which can be categorized as a basic and advanced tools. The basic one is one needed to accomplish the basic investor relation goals and meet the regulatory requirements, such as the annual General Assembly meetings, which is designed to fulfill legal requirements rather than enhance communication. And the second one, which is the annual report, which tends to be a dry, I can say, recitation of historical facts, while more advanced one are layered on top of the basic tools to achieve the highest possible level of communication with the investment community, where the earnings call, the quarterly earnings call, for example, investor day or roadshows, where it requires much more personal involvement by the senior management of the C-suite team. Once the IRO set up the most appropriate mix of these tools to achieve the IR objectives and even the organization's objective, the IRO should also create a measurement system to evaluate the effectiveness of those tools. Example of appropriate metrics are changes in the stock liquidity, for example, the number of requests of financial information, even changes in the mix of investors and the number of analysts covering the company. So all of these, if we put it in the right context, we will come up with these, I can say, well-defined KPIs for any IRO. Another fact, which is creating the company's equity story, can require a considerable amount of time as well. To do so requires, I can see, several of processes where it can be part of the IR policy. First of all, the IRO should gather the historical information about the company, interviews with the internal management team, and know exactly about the company's strengths and weaknesses. Knows the industry trends and identify peer companies and their stories as well. Based on these set of information, the IRO creates several one-sentence, I can say, stories about the company, each one briefly stating what the company does. So once the equity story line is completed, the IRO must carefully build upon it to emphasize how this excellent prospective investment opportunity. Then the IRO have to package the story of any organization and amplify it, enhance it with the supporting information. Definitely the quarterly reporting cycle, or let's say the quarterly reporting period, is a primary duty of the investor relation function, since it directly connects member of company's management team or the C-suite with the investment community. This direct interface is extremely important for the market. The analyst and both existing and potential investors have a chance to meet and listen to a company's management team, and I believe by listening to market, in which plays a key factor to align with the market expectations. This is just an overview or a summary on how the investor relation should be involved in every single area of the organization.
Haitham, thank you very much. And by the way, audience, there is a Q&A facility, so please take the opportunity to ask us any questions. Naturally, George, Haitham, and I will now have a discussion based on those opening remarks from our speakers. And Haitham, I'll just come back to you, because let's cast our mind back to the beginning of last year, which is when I believe you joined HMG. You obviously didn't know exactly what was going to be unfolding, but what you did know was that the company was planning to go public, which I think it did right as the pandemic gripped, which would have been around about March time. And I'm just wondering, from an organizational point of view at that point, what did the team look like, and what was the team thinking as you were going public?
Looking at the time of the listing of HMG in end of March, and 17th of March, and it was in parallel of the COVID pandemic. It was a really difficult time. But the main objectives of our management, or even the IR strategy, which is driven by our board of directors, is to be more focused and close to the investment community. The management conducted several road shows and a meeting with the investment community during the roadshow or pre-IPO process, if I can say. Then post the listing, this is the role of IRO, the role of investor relation. They start communicating and keep the, I can say, momentum of the investment community with the organization. So it's a kind of an extensive set of written remarks, whether in a quarterly basis or even semi-annually or even annually. It's about formulating the equity story again, as I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, and trying to be more close to your audience from the investment community. Both, it can be a buy side or a sell side, even those potential investors as well. So maintaining the momentum with the market, and I believe is the key. And alhamdulillah, during 2020, we conducted several meetings. We have even exceeded 200 meetings with both sell and buy side, making sure that we are delivering the right message to them, and being close to their concerns about the company, and even during the COVID as well. So it's several of components that we take in our consideration while we are building the messages to our investment community.
What's interesting to me, Haitham and George, is clearly there was a plan. It wasn't derailed. I know we always say in investor relations training that you essentially manage what you can manage, and frankly, you just have to navigate everything else that's happening around you. We live in very dynamic, very volatile, very difficult market conditions still. And George, I just want to go back to the point that you made to reinforce what Haytham's saying around strategic thinking, around direction, around the planning. Clearly, nothing derailed HMG's story. And I'm assuming, although you can correct me, given that you were one of their advisors, that in their sector, it's by definition, given where the world is today, perhaps one of the most attractive sectors there is. And with a great story, they had a plan, and that plan just went ahead regardless of what they couldn't see or what they couldn't control at the time. Could you just help us put some perspective on that and the sector and the market more broadly, given what they went through?
Okay, it was bound to happen eventually. That's a really good question, John. Thank you. I think look, and in a moment I'll defer to Haitham, who's obviously on the inside of HMG as an organisation. But I know that certainly in the first, let's say the first 6 to 9 months of the company being listed, as would be the case with any new issuer, but I think was perhaps especially the case for a new issuer in the in the market conditions in which the company went public, there was a huge amount of interest from the investment community, both the buy side and the sell side, on the market itself, not just on what the company was doing to manage the difficult circumstances in which it was operating. So I think, as we all know, and as everyone on this call knows, this time last year, what were investors most interested in at company level or at financial level? It was about how strong was the balance sheet. How are you going to protect? How are you going to safeguard your cash flows? How are you managing working capital? But I think in the case of Habib, and indeed of many other companies, but certainly across the healthcare sector, I think we saw that the investment community was very, very interested in what management's expectations were for market conditions, and that's a really, really difficult thing to comfortably predict, or to kind of put your flag in the sand and say, I think this is going to happen in the next quarter, or this is going to be the situation in the next 12 months. It's very difficult to do, but it's something that you do need to be ready to do, at least to an extent, without overexposing yourself or creating false expectations in the market. Because, as you said earlier, John, investors do need to understand what the long-term roadmap is, not just the short-term one. And going back to Haytham's point earlier about the strength and the resilience of the equity story, this, for me, was a key differentiator for the company. Yes, they responded incredibly effectively to the challenges and indeed the opportunities of COVID-19, but they didn't stray, they didn't diverge at all from the long-term strategic roadmap that they had already set out during the listing. And indeed, they are still sticking to that narrative because it remains, it remains firmly in place as a strategy. But it's one thing saying that you're sticking to it, but then proving that you are is a completely different is a completely different challenge. And this is where the earnings cycle really comes to the fore in terms of reinforcing what you are telling the market, because you need to be using KPIs that IR is communicating through both the quarterly cycle and indeed in between stops in the earnings cycle to demonstrate that you're delivering on the KPIs that you've set for the organization, or indeed not delivering on some. No investor expects a company to deliver or exceed every single one of their KPIs in every single earnings presentation or on every single earnings call. But providing management can demonstrate that they're doing something to resolve a situation, then that establishes greater confidence among your shareholder base. So that's, I guess, the kind of reactive side of it. The proactive forward planning part of it is equally important. If you look at your kind of earnings toolkit, and as an absolute minimum, it contains your disclosure on the Saudi exchange, and the publication of your financials. That's all one is obliged to do. You go a step further, and that toolkit includes maybe a slightly more detailed, sophisticated earnings release, right, which can be digested by media, but is also something that the analyst community can use a little bit more effectively. And then you go a step further and you have an earnings call, and you go a step further and you have a fact sheet, and you go a step further and you have maybe a retail-oriented earnings release or infographics or multimedia content that you can push out through digital and social channels. All of that requires a lot of preparation, and obviously the wider and the deeper the toolkit and the more complex the information it contains, the more planning is required. And that's where the role of the IRO becomes so important, not just in in preparing management for a call, but actually for dealing with multiple stakeholders from all around the organization. And as Haitham spends a lot of time working on this at HMG, as do all IROs, to gather all of that disparate financial and non-financial information, put it into one place in a system that can be wheeled out, from quarter to quarter again and again, and it becomes smoother and smoother, and in a way that's then consistent for the people who are consuming that information, so that they can compare the last quarter with the current quarter. They can compare this year with last year. That's where the skill of the IRO really comes in, I think. So it's about showing the long-term vision from a kind of conceptual thematic perspective and measuring it. And it's about, from a more practical process-oriented perspective, being prepared to deliver that information in the most impactful possible way.
George, that's why we call this session, this workshop, IR Essential. So you've just had there, folks, a wonderful overview of the thinking. And then if we turn to the process, Haitham, we cast our minds back to the middle of 2020. Your first quarter, I'm assuming, would have been assuming it's a calendar year reporting, would have been the 30th of June. So you've had 3-4 months or so having gone public. Obviously, everyone's in the same position, recognizing that the world around us is changing, but you still have that responsibility of reporting. And I'm just wanting you to share with us the process behind the scenes in terms of the planning coming out of IPO in March and thinking about the following quarter, because as we shared earlier when we were chatting, I always thought when I was doing the job that in many ways, part of the role of IR was to try to institutionalize that process. George has mentioned some of the internal audiences. Haitham, you've mentioned them, whether at board level, C-suite level, or indeed the teams that support you in your IR across different functions. And I always found that actually was my starting point. But in many ways, that was one of the most difficult things to achieve, because not everybody appreciates IR, not everybody knows IR. And I spent probably far too long in my first few months, if not year, basically trying to educate internally to ensure that people knew who and what IR did. And then, of course, getting ready for the next quarterly reporting, the next cycle, and over time trying to institutionalize that. Now, if you throw all that into the midst of the global pandemic, I'm just wondering what thought processes helped you and didn't help you, casting your mind back a year, Haitham.
So you just brought me back to the challenges during the mid of 2020. So it's all about managing a reporting cycle, whether it's related to the earning call or even any other materials or a reporting period as well. So as I mentioned, preparing an extensive set of written remarks for every event or every updates or developments in a quarterly basis or on a monthly basis. If the management team instead delivers off-the-cuff remarks from a short outline of topics, the listener will not think that the management team is willing to share any kind of key updates or significant updates to the investment community or to the market. So one of the I can say useful tools that we went through during every single quarter is using a script. Gives the IRO plenty of time to develop thoroughly a clear presentation, so that there is no information is missed that would be left to interpretation by the market. Prepared script also allows the IROs to develop a certain theme to the call that participants can state clearly and repeatedly as well. So when setting up an IR program, the planning comes as a key to ensure teams are working ahead of reporting deadlines, whether a reporting that we are referring to is a quarterly earnings or any kind of engagement with the investment community. So the IR should have IR calendar, which provides a visibility for the team and other internal stakeholders on the reporting cycle. Another key role definitely is the internal engagement, where the IR teams should identify internal stakeholders, those needed to be involved in your communication and engagement with the investment community. Another key, I believe, role is the management participation. CEO and CFO in particular is vital during the reporting cycle. However, management time should be maximized. Having a clear approval process and a clear rules and responsibility management time can be best utilized. I can say that in summary, identifying the principle of getting engaged with the market and developing a clear policies and procedures ensures all team members, including the management, are aligned on their rules, requirements, aware of the regulatory obligation and working toward the same goal. Be more focused on the preparation side of the pre-results engagement with the market. The IR team should work with the internal stakeholders to agree on metrics that will be reported on a quarterly basis, which can be differ from one quarter to another quarter based on the facts happened into that quarter. This should be support the company in better articulating its equity story and in addressing key investor questions. Keep in mind that agreed key messages for the quarter should be incorporated with the broader strategic message of the organization. And one more thing, that the IR should work closely with the relevant functions such as a finance team, governance team, or compliance team to develop market disclosure and any other relevant materials as part of the quarterly reporting toolkit. I believe one more thing that should be mentioned, that the IRO should clearly define the rules between the entire team. This can be defined whether in the IR policy or in even a higher level of communication matrix, and should be upheld when preparing the results. For example, who will be providing the operational updates, when the financial statements be shared with the IR team or the relevant team as well, when the legal or the compliance team going to be involved, who's responsible for uploading these announcements to the exchange system, which is called AlShathri in the Saudi exchange system. So all of these activities, it's a part of formulating the overall engagement and even will preparedness from organization point of view.
This is music to my ears, Haitham, because I think, casting my own mind back many years, one of the mistakes we made as a relatively new IR team as well, because we were also post-IPO, was we failed to institutionalize any sort of standard operating procedures across the organization. Of course, we knew what we were doing, but we assumed wrongly that everybody knew who we were, what we were doing, and what they were supposed to do, with the inevitable result that you got some misfires, including mistakes in terms of putting information out at the wrong time through the wrong channels, believe it or not. And this was, dare I say, an exchange, a market operator, but you know, we all have to learn. And I think provided you don't repeat the mistakes, and as you rightly said, Haitham, you document, you attempt to begin to institutionalize, if not come up with a standard set of procedures, processes, operating manual type approach, so that every time you do something, it's actually documented. Every time you learn a lesson, albeit even through a mistake, it's documented, so that regardless of who the personnel are, the comms team, the corporate secretary, the finance team, they're all aware of their own moving parts. And of course, as you said, you get to a D-Day, as we like to say in the UK, where regardless of whether you like it or not, you know, there is a date for the results announcement, there is a time for the results announcement. And as you said, if all the planning is done the proper way and all the hard work is already put in, it's like running a race, isn't it? When they press the firing gun, you hope that you cross the line in one piece and successfully. So I really like the way you describe that, because it is remarkably process driven. By nature, I'm not a particularly detailed or process-driven person. I rely on really good people like Alicia and other teammates to do all the important parts, but I don't mind being there at the starting line and having a go. But I like your description very much. George, I'm just going to turn to you, because I think what Haitham picked up on was something we were discussing earlier in terms of extra financial or non-financial information. And I think it goes without saying that stories evolve. Haitham's already said part of the role is listening, obviously taking feedback, making sure that management and hopefully in the end the board recognize what the market perception is, what the market's saying, regardless of how good the results, regardless of how good IR is or how clever management is or thinks it is. At the end of the day, audiences have the right to have opinions, have the right to reflect back to you what they actually read or see. And I think in the environment of COVID-19, the E, the S and the G, environmental, social, call it people, and governance factors, in many ways bubbled to the surface. And I'm just wondering, from a planning point of view, from a strategic point of view, given you work with lots of companies in the region, what a difference that might have made to good old results reporting on a short-term or quarterly basis.
Yeah, that's a good question. We're starting to see it change. I have to say, it would be dishonest of me to claim that Q1 2021 was suddenly a watershed moment and every issuer in Saudi Arabia had a ton of ESG slides in their earnings presentations. That has not happened. But these things don't happen immediately, right? We are seeing a much firmer commitment by a lot of issuers to at least integrating ESG metrics or reporting criteria into their quarterly earnings process. In any case, and if we, just for the sake of argument, if we take an earnings call and the supporting presentation as an example of one of the engagements that take place on a quarterly basis, In any case, that presentation and the narrative that supports it should contain more than simply financial information. It does need to contain, as we discussed, longer term strategic discussion. And that is where we are seeing more integration at this stage of ESG. I think we haven't reached a point yet where hard ESG oriented data is being reported on a quarterly basis. We are seeing that certainly on an annual basis now from a lot of issuers in the Saudi market, and indeed on an interim basis. I think I would like to think that this time next year we'll start seeing it coming through on a quarterly basis as well. That'll be much more commonplace than it is now. That's not to say it doesn't exist. It does. It is happening. But what we are certainly seeing from the investment community is more appetite to receive it. And the important thing is that issuers respond to that. It doesn't, you know, there have been a number of ESG webinars hosted recently by Mirror, and there's been a very common theme there that that journey does not, you know, it doesn't start and end overnight. It starts and then it's a very long journey, and it can be quite a slow journey. But actually, a lot of companies that are engaged in IR in a meaningful way in the Saudi market are already taking it much more seriously than they were certainly 12 months ago, which is really good. But if you look at it from the other side of the fence, if you like, from your key audience, the investment community, the demand is there and it's growing. And I think this is where that the idea of earnings season being about listening as much as it is about communicating is incredibly important. In our opinion, we would always advise our clients, or on behalf of our clients, we would start speaking with the investment community ahead of the earnings, obviously in a very measured and sensible way, because you're in a quiet period, you're not going to disclose any information, but you should be listening and you should be absorbing their views. What are their concerns? What are they potentially happy about? What are they potentially unhappy about? Whether it's in the financials, whether it's in market conditions, it's in the company strategy, or indeed in ESG. And then use the rest of the earnings season to listen more, because that will help you shape your message for the quarter. But then you have the earnings call, and you really should be listening to the questions they're asking. How is there a theme here? You know, are they chiefly concerned with one or two particular issues? And if so, and we haven't addressed them sufficiently here, we should use the opportunity to address them after this call, and then do that. And then not just listen on the earnings call, but then listen after it as well. So you have your earnings call, it's attended by, let's say, 50 or 60 portfolio managers and sell side analysts. Handpick a few of those and give them a call after the earnings call, and understand what they thought was good and what they weren't perhaps comfortable with or they weren't convinced by. And then again, use as an opportunity for the next quarter, or indeed for communications in between stops in the calendar. And there's no doubt in my mind that as the quarters pass by this year and next year, more and more of those concerns will be ESG related, because the mandates that those investors have are changing and they are becoming more restrictive. They are becoming more difficult for them to service in an appropriate way if the appropriate level of disclosure is not there from those Saudi issuers. So this is a theme that we're only going to see increase, and it's a theme that we're really encouraging all of our clients to start integrating into the regular existing IR and disclosure cycle.
Super, George, and incredibly instructive. And again, Haitham, I mean, it's hard enough going public. It's hard enough being thrown into your first set of quarterly results, let alone worrying about financial year end. And then, of course, we throw in a global pandemic for good measure. Just in terms of what George is saying about non-financial, extra-financial, or broader issues for broader stakeholders over and above your immediate audience, the investment community. I'm just wondering in terms of the thought process, in terms of the management response, and how IR has had to basically respond, say in 2021 versus what you saw, you know, when you first started. What's changed, and how is that non-financial or ESG reporting beginning to find its way into your processes for results announcements?
I'm exactly agreed with what has been mentioned by you and George. And I believe the next nightmare for any IRO is the ESG. Now, I believe every IRO should be involved on the ASG principle and how they are going to formulate these messages to the investment community. And I believe the most important thing when you get engaged with the investment community is not only being engaged with them during these quarterly earnings call, rather than having these mid calls between every quarter. At the end, the investment community will like to hear what they are expecting, not exactly what you need to send a kind of message to them during the call. Otherwise, you will be in a position of just sending the information or messages from one way to another, which is from the organization to the investment community, where it should be in a proactive way and listening to them, know exactly which kind of expectation or information they are looking for, and then you can address all of these concerns during the earnings call. So, and I believe one of the vital role of the investor relation is to get engaged with those buy side and sell side, know exactly what's their perception between the earnings call, and address all of their concerns during the earnings call. This is one thing, and I believe the second thing, especially when we look at the sell side of the investment market, and I believe is of great use to the IRO, because it can not only attract capital for the company, but also contribute greatly to reach the fair value of the stock price. For example, I believe based on several studies have shown that greater the number of analysts covering the company, the higher possibility to reach the company's fair value. And even the sell-side engagement is also recommended to discuss a kind of assumptions on their models and addressing any gaps on the market. In many cases, IR teams can hold several meetings and provide access to management where it's required. And besides providing this information to the sell side, it's also possible to create a reverse flow of information back to the company's management to know exactly what the market are expect from you as an organization. Some analysts will provide information about how their rating systems work and under what circumstances they will upgrade or downgrade stock ratings. This extremely useful for any anticipating when the announcement of a new information or development by the company will trigger a change in analyst recommendation. In addition, it may be possible to discuss the potential strategic scenarios with the analyst to see how they respond or to find out what they consider to be a key issue within the company's market. So, and I believe the IRO must be proactive and continually plumbing the contacts for feedback. This is from sell side point of view. If you look on the other side, we have the buy side as well, investors, both existing and potential buy side investors. And before engaging with them, you should, as an IRO, determine their investment strategies to see exactly if the fund or if the companies meet their criteria, ESG for instance, as we mentioned. So the IRO needs to understand how the buy side expect to be treated. I can say that first they expect a tailored one-on-one meetings where management makes a private presentation and engagement to them and sets aside sufficient time to answer all of their inquiries or questions. This is the first one. The second, and I believe they will expect management to conduct a quarterly earnings call, as we mentioned on the beginning of this webinar, so that they can receive the latest update and information about the company's operational and financial results, in addition definitely to the strategic outlook or view, and have an opportunity to pose questions to the management. The last one can be the third, is to not bury them with the annual reports and promotional materials, since they are already wading through a massive amounts of material sent to them by other companies. Instead, what we can do as a proactive IRO is prepare a summarized version of a key information from a public domain reports and send it to them in the formats they prefer. For example, at HMG, we have a monthly newsletter. We send it to our investors, which is a very summary about the operational and new updates about the company. So this is just a summarized view how we are interacting with the both sell side and buy side investors.
Thank you, Haitham. IR never stands still. And one point that I picked up on what you said, given I've just read one of the questions on ESG, is I think you've hit the nail on the head when you said essentially you're making sure that you don't just listen, but also that you determine whether anything to do with non-financial or ESG related factors is actually material or actually germane or important to your business. And I think often it's forgotten that just because there is this new category of reporting, let's call it non-financial, let's call it ESG, one of the biggest difficulties in response to the question that I've just read is it's very difficult to compare apples with apples. And I wouldn't encourage you to do that. I would encourage you to do what Haitham has just outlined, which is obviously you listen, obviously you take on the feedback, but then you have to determine with management, the decision makers, the guys, the girls running the business, hang on, is this relevant? Is this material or not? And then having established some materiality factors, you begin to work out, as George was suggesting, well, maybe you can employ a framework, 2 frameworks, however many frameworks there are out there. And again, just to emphasize from the discussions we've been having over the past few months around ESG, one of the issues, one of the difficulties for companies is there isn't a like-for-like comparison necessarily for market to market, sector to sector, even company to company, because each business has its own strengths. Each business is run in a pretty unique way with a different value proposition. And in many ways, that's the opportunity for IR. That's the opportunity for IR to determine with management what makes sense for the business and the way you run the business and how should you best present it. And as George said, it's not as though we're suddenly going to be doing a different type of reporting, particularly on a quarterly basis. It's just not going to happen. Maybe over the next few years, we'll be able to determine which are the most useful frameworks, how best we can respond to what the most important stakeholders require, including, of course, the investors, the people that put money into your organization. But just off the top of my head, if any of you are interested, particularly the person who asked that very good question on apples with apples comparisons in ESG, we're actually doing another talk tomorrow where we've got an ESG expert basically helping us understand some of the frameworks. And while the frameworks can be useful, I think ultimately, as Haitham was saying, you determine with management what makes most sense, you determine how to report it, and of course you live and learn as you continue that journey or that process. I was just going to come back to the quarterly results reporting, Haitham, and just sort of put you on the spot a bit in terms of what the IR team is trying to achieve on behalf of management in terms of the target audiences. You've mentioned the sell side. I'm sure when you went public, you had X number of research houses covering you. I don't know whether it's part of the IR KPI or job to try and increase the research coverage, but I'm interested in how you go about the targeting, whether on the sell side, of course, on the investor targeting side, the buy side, but also perhaps other channels like media. How do you prioritize the audiences and the channels or the platforms with which to reach those audiences on a quarterly basis?
Yes, John. And I believe one of the key concerns for any IRO is dealing with the disclosure rules. A company can get in serious difficulty with the disclosure. It leaks material information to the market without also giving it a widespread distribution through a few approved communication channels. So the IRO must advise the management on a proposed announcement key to ensure the key materials information not get leaked. implemented a well-designed disclosure policy and related procedure to ensure that only approved materials information is released to the market, and that definitely it's released in approved format. So this is a matter on a quarterly disclosure. But if you look at the engagement with the media outlets, the sell side, the buy side investors, definitely keeping or maintaining our proactive engagement with those investors is definitely the key. Having, as we mentioned on the other topics, is having the feedback and even kind of hearing their perception on the market performance also is another key. We have conducted at GMG in the last, I believe in the Q3 of last year, we conducted the perception study where more than 300 investors were involved on this study, and keeping know exactly which kind of information that we would like to share with them, and even know more about our weaknesses when it comes to the disclosure and materials as well. This is one thing. The second thing is the periodical conferences that's held by the bankers or other banking services. Get engaged with those buy side, profiling them in the right context, knowing exactly what's their investment strategy when it comes to whether in an index level or in industry level, and knowing their investment metrics and criteria as well. So all of these put it on the right context, and then you can be able to target your audience based on these facts.
Haitham, I like your thinking, and I like the way you explain the processes, and it seems like you embarked on an IR journey with a wonderful business, and you continue to refine the milestones around which you build your KPIs for IR. And I can also see that it's very, very linked to what management is thinking and the way the business is run. Before I come back to you, Haitham, with some closing thoughts or top tips for your peers, the IR officers in the audience, I'm just going to turn to George first. And there's a specific question, George, perhaps some tips around getting started in ESG, if not trying to find sources of information that compare companies in Saudi Arabia, whether across peer groups, whether across sectors, or even across markets. If you've got any thoughts or tips on that, George, for the question asked.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think getting started really, certainly we advise our clients to do two things before they dive in. The first is benchmarking. So understand what your peer group are doing, not just in the kingdom, but probably, frankly speaking, across the world. Benchmarking should be used not only to show what you can achieve in the short term, but what you could aspirationally achieve in the long term. So if you take depending on your sector, it should be possible to take a sample group of, let's say, 4 to 5 international businesses. One might be in the Saudi market, but again, I think as we would agree, there's only a handful of companies as it stands today who are at least advanced or well developed on their ESG journey, not just in Saudi, but in most of the GCC, which means that your pool of potential benchmarks is a little bit narrower. So look at the sector that your company is in, and then identify, let's say, 2 or 3 peers from other emerging markets, and then maybe 2 or 3 peers from developed markets who are much more mature in their ESG journey. Understand exactly what they're doing across the E, the S, and the G, which frameworks they're complying with, what their reporting methodologies are, what are their material issues, how have they integrated ESG into their business model, into their strategy, into their governance framework, into their internal reporting and in the external reporting practices. And based on a relatively detailed benchmarking study, you will then have a much clearer picture as an organization on not only where you stand, which may be quite low down the pecking order at that point, but where you can get to in the short term, in the medium term, and in the long term. So what you can aspire to. Now, as John mentioned earlier, the material issues still won't be identical from company to company, even if at face value they're very similar businesses and they're in the same sector. The material issues will not be the same. They will be similar, perhaps, but they won't be the same. So the next step after doing that benchmarking is a materiality assessment, and actually that really does feed in even before you've embarked on the ensuing ESG journey. That alone builds in to some of the materials that you're likely to develop around earnings, and indeed at the end of the year, because if you can very clearly map out and identify the most material issues to your business, then that means that you have a very, very solid platform on which to then build a more advanced, a more forward-thinking ESG integration program and indeed ESG communication program. Because from an IR perspective, you can be doing all the ESG in the world, but if it's not being recorded and reported and communicated, it's frankly useless. So those are the two kind of starting points that we always advise our clients to do at the beginning of that process. And I think the other thing that allows you to do is, if you are tentative and if you don't want to overstretch or indeed overcommit, you'd rather take small steps and do it right and then build it up over time, it allows you to do that as well. Because you can very clearly say, well, this is maybe achievable in a year, this is achievable in 2 years, and this is achievable in 10 years. And it's fine to map that out in your earnings materials or indeed in your annual report and say, you know, we're not perfect, but this is where we've got to so far. This is how we view the future. This is the roadmap. And over time, from quarter to quarter and from year to year, you're going to be seeing us reporting in more and more detail on these material issues. But having a slide in your Q1 earnings deck saying that you've given £1 million to a charity is very nice, but it doesn't necessarily really fulfill any ESG value at all, because it has to be aligned with the material issues of your business, and it has to contribute to the sustainability of your business, not of that charity. So it needs to be viewed from that perspective, and if you can complete those two sort of initial steps, you'll already be in a very strong position to start integrating ESG metrics, or at the very least ESG messages, into your quarterly and your interim and your annual earnings materials.
Excellent, George. I mean, I can't say any more. I don't know, Haitham, whether you want to add anything to that excellent commentary on ESG reporting, and/or, given that we're in the last few minutes, add a few parting comments, if not top tips for your peers on your own view of how we started looking at quarterly reporting, the opportunity of all that reporting, and obviously treating it as an evolution rather than a one-off or black or white. This is it and that's it. Haitham.
And I totally agree with what has been exactly mentioned by George now, and I believe ESG is something that's gonna be, I believe, in the next 2-3 years, gonna be mandate for all those listed companies. So, and I believe if you don't get the chance and start from the meantime, starting to gather and even define the basis and formulating your strategy when it comes to the ESG, you will be in a position that not be liked by the investment community. And even if you look at it from the government perspective, and I believe now the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia have conducted several initiatives when it coming to the environmental practices and ESG in particular, and even some of those governmental bodies started to enforce kind of aspects or components of the ESG on their practices in their bodies as well. So, and I believe the ESG is as I mentioned, it's going to be the next nightmare for any IRO. And based on my humble experience, I can say that it's a really a good opportunity for the company to build their story on ESG going forward. And I believe now still not that much mature in our market, but I believe, as mentioned by George, looking at the global benchmark on how they are implementing ESG is going to be added value for any organization they are willing to implement the ESG practice or standards.
Haitham, I love your honesty. As brutal as it sounds, folks, while we started clearly with just the aim of talking about results reporting on a quarterly basis, because that's the statutory reporting requirement, I'm hoping that through the excellent presentations of both Haitham and George, and in response to your questions, we've helped fill out what is more than just a statutory reporting requirement. We've hopefully positioned your quarterly reporting as a wonderful opportunity. And if you begin to add the color that Haitham and George mentioned, whether we call it ESG reporting, sustainability reporting, non-financial, whatever we call it, it's here to stay. I don't think anyone in the past 15 months, unless you are hiding under a rock, my favorite expression, recognizes anything but the world is changing. And of course, we change with it as business people. And of course, IR has to reflect that both internally and externally. So on that note, if I can just thank all you good people for taking the time to join us.